So we're looking at the cross of Christ, and I said to understand it, we can break it into two parts, as a revelation, simply as a teaching. And then we'll look also at the cross of Christ as an invitation to discipleship, to a particular kind of discipleship. But we're still looking at the cross of Christ as a revelation of God's unconditional love, and as a revelation of vulnerability, exousia, as the power on this planet. And there's a third one I want to talk about briefly, and that is the cross of Christ also reveals God's identification with the victim. And it also reveals the victim as the cornerstone inside of the community and God's fellow suffering with us. Now, what does that mean? You know, the cross of Christ, sometimes, you know, if you go to, like in theology schools and in theology, we have all kinds of debates as to, you know, like, where is the cross of Christ? Like, for instance, I'm with the Oblate congregation, and we're a congregation, we say, well, we're dedicated to serving the poor. So we have all these congresses who say, well, who are the poor? Is it the materially poor? Is it the spiritually poor? Is it the starving? Or is it the person who's going to commit suicide who may have $1 million? Like, who are the poor? Now, that's a valid question, but biblically it becomes really clear, you know. The poor, that the cross of Christ, see, the cross of Christ identifies with the poor, you know. See, in the Old Testament, the prophet said God has a preferential option for the poor. That's already in the Old Testament. The New Testament goes further. It doesn't just say, Jesus doesn't just say I have a preferential option for the poor, but I identify with the poor, you know. Whatsoever you do to me. God is in the poor. But who are those poor? Well, we have all kinds of debates, but actually it's pretty clear. Remember when Jesus is crucified and Caiaphas, the high priest, pronounces the great sentence, and he said, it's better that one person should die for the people. And he was singling out Jesus. Okay? Whoever the person is who is the excluded one, that's where the cross of Christ is. And that keeps changing. At any given time, who in our society is considered dispensable? Who is it better that this person should die, that society can go on? And that keeps changing, you know. But it's not abstract either. You can name it. Like in our culture, who is it? A number of groups. So for instance, the poor. Notice a lot of times when we make budget decisions at federal government levels and so on, who is the excluded one? The poor. They don't have any power, you know. That's where the cross of Christ is. But for instance, abortion, you know. We say, well, if these people are born, it's going to be inconvenient. It's better they shouldn't be born. That's the poor. Or even one that's less favorable for many of us to hear, capital punishment. You know, the day we executed Timothy McVeigh, you know, at that moment, he's the most important spiritual person in the community. He's the excluded one. Sometimes it's hard for people to get that. You know, well, he's guilty and he was an unrepentant murderer. Doesn't matter. He's structurally innocent. He's like the woman caught in adultery. He's the one standing against the crowd. The crowd's always mindless. And the crowd is saying, it's better this person should die for the people. You know, I can't be too strong on capital punishment and how much it goes against Scripture. You know, a little story. I want to tell you a story and see if you get the irony of this story, okay? Captain Cook, who sailed the world, and Captain Cook was a real person, not just a mythical person. And he kept diaries, quite extensive diaries. And at one stage, Captain Cook stayed in the Polynesian Islands for several years. And he befriended the chief and the people, and he learned their language. And one day the chief took Captain Cook to a human sacrifice. They still sacrificed humans on altars. And Cook witnessed this, and he was horrified. Afterwards, he told the chief, he said, you're a primitive people. This is terrible. He said, in England, we'd hang you for that. Okay. Now, see, now I'm glad you picked up the irony. See, tribal people called it human sacrifice. We call it capital punishment. Or we might call it abortion, or we might call it whatever. Euthanasia. Wherever it's deemed this person is expendable, that's where the cross of Christ is. You know, those of you who have read Elie Wiesel, or Wiesel, or however you pronounce his name, the great Jewish writer who won the Nobel Prize. But remember, he was in a Nazi prison camp. So he tells this story, a horrific story. He said one day a bunch of prisoners had escaped, and the Nazis knew that somebody had helped them. They couldn't do this alone. So they wanted to find out who the collaborators were, but nobody would fess up, as the English say. And so what they did to try to make somebody confess, they brought out a 12-year-old boy and they hung him in the courtyard and they made everybody watch this. And as this young boy is dying, Wiesel said people were reacting different ways. Some were swearing, some were praying, some were crying. You know, so at a certain point someone shouted, "Where is God? Where is God in this?" And then one old man said, "God is on the rope. God's on that rope." See, that's the cross. See, God is always where the suffering one is, and that they're inside of that. You know, where is God in all of this? I want to give you a powerful little scriptural piece on this. You know, in John's gospel, and John's gospel is written really, really different than all the other gospels. You know, so you notice with John's gospel, there's no infancy narratives, there's no Christmas story, there's no baby Jesus, there's no, you know, little boy Jesus confounding the elders. Jesus appears midway through chapter 1 as a complete adult, already in harness, you know. So in John's gospel, you have, you know, that prologue, beginning was the Word, and then halfway through chapter 1, Jesus is full grown, and he kicks off real quick in John's gospel, you know. And these are the first words out of his mouth. In John's gospel, the disciples of John the Baptist, they're looking at Jesus out of curiosity. It's the first word Jesus is introduced. And they ask Jesus, Jesus says to them, "What are you looking for?" Which is then going to be the hermeneutic for the whole gospel. Basically, John's whole gospel is to answer that. What are we looking for? The way, the truth, the life, you know, the water that we drink and never thirst again. But then Jesus said, "What are you looking for?" And they say to him, "Where do you live?" That's a good question. See, and Jesus says, "Come, I'll show you," which is also a hermeneutic for the gospel. See, in John's gospel, Jesus is divine the whole time. There's very little humanity in Jesus. He comes from God, and he's going to show us where God lives. Okay? But remember this line. Where do you live? Jesus says, "Come, I'll show you." Okay? Now, you get to later on in John's gospel when Lazarus dies. And incidentally, that's an interesting text altogether, as the Irish say. You know, you get the impression in John's gospel that, see, Mary and Martha are sisters and Lazarus is their brother, and Jesus is pretty good friends with them, you know. And they may be his closest friends inside of the gospel. Now, he's up north preaching, and he hears Lazarus is dying. And he's maybe got a 4-hour walk. He doesn't go there. He preaches for another 3 days. He's dallying around. Then they come and say, Lazarus is dead. Jesus says, "Now I'll go down." What's behind that text? I mean, if you're 4 hours from here and you hear your best friend is dying, you're going to get on a plane, a train, a car immediately and rush down there. And so would Bruce Willis in Hollywood. And you're going to save, you know. But see, that ties to what we said before the break, you know, that God doesn't use power the way we do. Notice he lets Lazarus die, because our God is not so much a rescuing God as God is a redeeming God. He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, but he doesn't save him from death. Notice that's exactly what the Father does with Jesus. If you're the Son of God, come off the cross. Jesus, the Father lets him die. He raises him from the dead. See, our God doesn't rush in the way Hollywood does and use power to save us. He uses power to raise us, you know. But now, then Jesus goes down, and then you got Martha and Mary. An interesting scenario. Mary stays in the house. Remember, she's the contemplative one. She's chosen the better part. Martha comes out. She says to Jesus, "If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And in Martha's the practical one, that the words mean exactly what they say. She's saying, you know, why weren't you here? You could have saved Lazarus. My brother wouldn't be dead, you know. And Jesus says, your brother will rise again. She said, well, I know he's going to rise at the last day, you know. Jesus says, no, he's going to rise again. Then Mary comes out of the house and she repeats the exact same question. If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But when Mary says it, scholars say it means something different. Her question is much deeper. Her question is already the ultimate theodicy question. Where is God in human suffering? Where is God when kids die of cancer? Where is God in Lebanon right now? Where is God when all these tragedies and AIDS and stuff breaks out on the planet? See, her question is the big question, not just the practical question. Where were you when my brother died? See, from her mouth, the question's huge, it's universal. Where is God in the Holocaust? And then Jesus says to her, where have you put him? You know, human suffering. She'd say, where are you in human suffering? Jesus says, where is human suffering? And now notice her line. She says, come, I'll show you. Who is she quoting? She's quoting Jesus back to Jesus. See, he opens the gospel and he says, let me show you where God lives. And Mary's saying to Jesus, let me show you where human beings live. And then it's a powerful text. I often read this at funerals. They said, then Jesus began to cry. Notice, she invites God to see where human suffering is, and God enters it not to rescue it. He's going to redeem it afterwards. But God cries, he enters our suffering, he suffers death with us, Then Jesus began to cry. See, that's God's response. And the cross isn't Hollywood. It doesn't come out and save at the last minute. He dies with us. See, humbled with us, humiliated with us. Jesus began to cry, and then afterwards he raises Lazarus from the dead. There's a lot of theology in that text, and that should, steer our preaching and steer, our so on. See, our God, we're supposed to pray to be rescued, and occasionally God will rescue. Jesus says, pray and ask, and it doesn't even matter whether it's right or wrong, just ask. Okay? It's interesting. The Jews you're not supposed to have prayers of petition on the Sabbath. 6 days a week you can ask God for anything. On the Sabbath, you're only supposed to be grateful. You're only supposed to have prayers of gratitude. Interesting. But that's the third thing that's revealed in the cross, is that God suffers with us. And that God is where the suffering one is, that's where the cross of Christ is, and that's where spiritual wisdom and depth is at. Who's being excluded? Euthanasia, abortion, capital punishment, the poor when they make out the budget, and so on. Wherever we don't need these, that's where the cross of Christ is. And that's where spiritual wisdom lies. That's why some authors call it, to get the cross, you have to get the wisdom of the poor. You got to always be looking with their eyesight. Mary Jolietti is a wonderful theologian in Toronto. She always says that. She lives with the poor, with refugees. She said, it gives you a different eyesight. You always have to try to see the world from where the poor are standing. See, that's where the cross of Christ is. Now that's the first part. That's the cross of Christ as a revelatory event, an event that reveals God, and that's actually the most important. In that the hope is that we get the other parts. If we realize how loving God is, unconditional love, that we would then respond in kind. But that's the second part of the cross. Then the cross is an invitation to discipleship. It invites us in to do certain things. Now, what is an invitation for? I've divided it in just for analytical purposes. They tie it together into four things. The cross of Christ, the wisdom of the cross teaches us four things. The first one, that there is a necessary connection between a certain kind of suffering and humiliation and coming to depth, maturity, unselfishness, and glory. Just that. There's a necessary connection between them. I want to use two scripture texts to enter this with, and you'll recognize both. Okay, one of them even more clearly than the other. But remember, on the road to Emmaus, on Easter Sunday in the morning, which is a beautiful text in Luke 24. Luke says, on the morning of the resurrection, two disciples are walking away from Jerusalem. That's quite a statement. See, Jerusalem in Luke means the church. They're leaving the church, and they're heading towards Emmaus. Emmaus was a Roman spa. They were heading towards Vegas, because the church doesn't work anyway. Human consolation, and they were downcast, dejected. They meet Jesus on the road, and then Jesus said to them, why are you so dejected? And they said, you must be the only person in all of Jerusalem who doesn't know what's going on, which is greatly ironic because he's the only person who does know what's going on. Luke wants you to get that. And then they say to him, he plays dumb. What's going on? It's about Jesus, whom we had hoped. Notice past perfect tense. We had hoped he'd be the Messiah, but in fact he's crucified, humbled, humiliated, because crucifixion was the ultimate death, the ultimate humiliation. Be like dying of AIDS, I guess, or something, or being executed for pedophilia or something. It's just the ultimate humiliation. Okay. Then Jesus says to them in the harshest words he's going to speak in all of Luke, you stupid, foolish people. He said, wasn't it necessary? There's some necessary connection. Wasn't it necessary that the Christ should so suffer to enter into his glory? What's that connection? Wasn't it necessary? Okay. Well, hold that, and I want to give it to you with another text. It's kind of an interesting text. It happens twice in Scripture, where James and John, and one time they bring their mother along for extra firepower, and they come up to Jesus and they say, one time the mother does the speaking, said, I'd like my two sons, James and John, to have the seats in glory at your right and your left hand in heaven. And one time they asked for it themselves, said, we'd like to have the seats of glory, no, glory, at your right hand and your left hand. Then Jesus takes their question seriously. He doesn't say, well, for God's sakes, haven't you learned anything from me about humility and so on? He gives them the right question. He says, can you drink the cup? Can you drink the chalice? That means the chalice of suffering. Can you suffer humiliation? And of course, they're young and grandiose. They say, absolutely, bring it on. You ever heard that line from anybody? Okay. I said, no. They say, no, we can take the chalice of suffering, and then you don't want to understand this next part, okay? Jesus said, well, in fact, you will. You're going to drink the chalice of suffering, and everybody's going to drink the chalice of suffering. The chalice will come to you, but the glory might not come. He said, because the glory isn't mine to give. It's for the Father to assign, you know? Now he's saying, notice what Jesus is saying, he said, well, in fact, you're all going to drink the chalice of suffering. But you might not get the glory. Why not? Because Jesus says, I can't dictate whether you're going to get the glory. See, the path to glory is through suffering. He specifies it here. But it's not automatic. What's he saying there? Let me try to flesh this out, and that's the key to this, and the key to the cross. See, in fact, we're all going to suffer the cross in this life. We're all going to have our share of suffering, okay? But see, what suffering does, suffering is going to make us deep. Suffering is going to make you deep. There's nothing on this planet that drives us to depth the way suffering does. And the deeper the suffering, the deeper we're going to be. But you can be deep in two ways. You know, that can drive you to depth in terms of unselfishness, in terms of vision, in terms of goodness, in terms of giving your life away and so on. It can drive you to great maturity. It can also drive you to great bitterness, anger, and rage. You know the old expression, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely? That's true, but the reverse is also true. Powerlessness corrupts, and oftentimes powerlessness, absolute powerlessness corrupts absolutely. You know, the kids who take guns to school and shoot other kids because they experience powerlessness. You know, the person who takes a gun in San Diego to McDonald's and shoots 38 people because they're enraged, they're powerless. If you've ever read The Origin of Al-Qaeda, that's what it comes out of. Every successive Arab humiliation has set up Al-Qaeda. Just powerlessness. We're just going to take guns and kill people. You know, see, suffering is going to make us deep, but not necessarily bring us glory. See, it can also make you deep in rage and bitterness and anger. It can make you a murderer, or it can make you a saint. See, so go back to James and John. They tell Jesus, we'd like to come to glory the way you've come to glory. And he says, can you drink the chalice? Can you go through the Good Friday route? Can you suffer humiliation? And we'll talk about that, you know. And they say, yes, we can. He says, well, you will, because everybody's going to. But it might not bring you to Easter Sunday, you know. And that's not for Jesus to decide, that's for us to decide. See, we're going to go the Good Friday route. We're all going to die. We're all going to have humiliation and suffering and stuff in this life. Where is it going to lead to? Will it lead to glory, to Easter Sunday? Or will it turn us into a murderer or into a petty, bitter, angry person? You know, it's going to make you deep. You can be sure. Suffering is going to make you deep. But in what way? In an Easter Sunday way or in a murderous, petty, narrow way? You know. Now, let's look at that. How does suffering do this? I want to risk something here. It's just an earthy example from James Hillman, who was one of my favorite philosophers. He used to be a Jungian analyst. In fact, he used to run the Jungian Institute in Zurich. He's a man in his 70s now and a brilliant analyst. Writes some of, to my mind, the best secular books that are written. You know, he's written a new book recently on aging, which is brilliant. But I saw him in a seminar, symposium some years ago in Stanford. And he began his talk this way. In fact, he's a very humorous guy. He comes out and he says, well, he says, how many of you are here with the permission of your therapist? Then he said, well, how many of you here with your therapist, you know? He said, well, that's the problem. He said, all you sensitive people are in therapy. He said, meanwhile, our country's going to hell, you know. But at one stage he said this. He says, I used to be a therapist. And he said, I gave that up. He said, for many reasons. He said, I need to do some other things right now. He said, but one of the reasons I gave it up is because, he said, almost everybody comes to therapy for the wrong reasons. He says, people come to therapy and they say, like, empower me. I feel powerless. I get all this pain in my life. And he said, I always tell them, and they said, give me power. And I'll say, why? People with power are jerks, and sometimes worse. He says, I want to get you in touch with your helplessness, with your inferiority. He said, and that'll build some character. See, inferiority builds character. Inferiority takes you to depth. And he said this to about 600 of us in an auditorium. He said, if you think in your life and you're honest, and you look at what has made you deep, all the things that have made you deep are probably things you'd be ashamed to talk about, because they're all humbling things. And see, your successes, they've brought glory into your life, but they haven't brought depth into your life. The same as in a family. If you have a son or a daughter who becomes a pro basketball player or an Olympic athlete, that person brings glory into your family. They don't bring any character into your family. If you have a handicapped son or daughter, they'll bring some character to your family. And it's the same with our lives. So oftentimes the traits that we're ashamed of inside of our family, your mother was too fat, your dad was a nutcase, your body didn't turn out right, your hair, your teeth, whatever aren't right, you were the last person always chosen for a team, and so on. We're ashamed of those things. You know something? They're what made us deep. See, they are the Good Friday. And when Jesus says, this isn't abstract, when he says, isn't there a necessary connection? Wasn't it necessary to suffer a certain kind of humiliation? And that humiliation, brings the character, the depth, the glory, the selflessness into your life. Now, there's a danger it might not. It might also bring bitterness and anger and pettiness into your life. Poverty doesn't necessarily, and poverties of all kinds, don't necessarily make you a saint. But if you're a saint, you have to go through them. In terms of a metaphor, an image, we know that there is no way to get to Easter Sunday without going through Good Friday. And we always want that and don't feel bad. So did Jesus. Remember his drama in the garden? He is looking for a ring road around Good Friday. Remember, he says, Father, if there's another way, But that's the lesson of the cross, that to get to the glory of Easter Sunday, which is the glory of resurrection, the glory of depth, of maturity, of selflessness, of sanctity, of being a saint, and so on, the root is going down. It's going through a certain suffering, humiliation, and so on. And it's important to understand that, so that when we enter, and we all will, enter into suffering, humiliation, so on, and ultimately into death, and the loneliness of that death, and so on, it's meant to bring us to the glory of Easter Sunday. And the danger is it might not bring us there. Can you drink the chalice? Yes. Jesus says you will drink the chalice. But it might not bring you the glory. It'll only bring you the glory if you let it. If that becomes for you the route to sanctity and not the route to anger, bitterness, self-pity, and pettiness, and so on. A couple of things on that. There's a literature inside of the therapeutic community, which isn't that well hidden, and it's a good literature, where you get more and more psychologists and psychiatrists and people who are writing on this and writing with great depth. And like Hillman are saying, we have to really be careful when we do therapy, to not use the therapy to move people away from that suffering, which is exactly their route to greatness. There's a he was Polish born, but taught for years at the University of Alberta when I was a young student as a seminarian. I used to go down and listen to this guy. He's died since. A guy called Kazimir Dabrowski. He was a wonderful psychiatrist. And Kazimir Dabrowski used to say, in fact, that's the title of his famous book, psychoneurosis is not an illness. He says, a lot of times that all our sensitivity, our neuroses, these are signs of growth. They're signs that you're not a jerk. Now they're real painful, but they can lead you to depth. And I remember once a graduate student asked him this question in class, interesting question. They said to him, Like you write this book and you have this theory about psychoneuroses and our inferiorities and our weaknesses and our humiliations, they lead us to depth and to growth. He said, but couldn't it happen and shouldn't it happen the other way? Like if you're blessed, suppose you're born and you're loved wonderfully and your body turns out well and your life turns out well and you have great loving parents and you have everything going for you, shouldn't that make you deep? Shouldn't that be what, and you become grateful and you say, I want to give everything back? In fact, you have stories like that. That's Jean Vanier. That's Helen Prejean, so on, Dabrowski gave a good answer. He said, ideally, that's the way it should work. He said, except that in 40 years in psychotherapy, he says, I've only seen it work 1 in 1,000 cases. He said, 99.9% of people, we grow only through crisis. Only when our world falls apart. Only when we're in pain and humiliation do we move to deeper levels. See, there's nothing theoretically that says you can't get to Easter Sunday by going the route of gratitude. He said, except 99 out of 100 never do it. And those 99 of us, we got to go through humiliation, pain. Our mooring's got to be constantly knocked down. We always got to have to be in regular Good Fridays for us to come to Easter Sunday. I want to give you another scripture text because the scripture is so wonderful on this, and see whether you think Jesus is a little harsh on Peter. And it's right after Peter has one of his starry moments. Peter hasn't got many good moments in the Gospels, but the odd time he gets it right, and this time he got it right. And that's in Mark's Gospel, right at the breaking point of Mark's Gospel, where Jesus says to the disciples, who do you say I am? Or who do people say I am? Then they said, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're a prophet come back. Then he says to them, who do you say I am? Then Peter answered. Peter says, you are Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says, blessed are you, Peter, because flesh and blood haven't revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And then he goes, immediately Jesus says, but now I got to go down to Jerusalem, and I'm going to die. And the Son of Man's going to suffer and be humiliated, and he's going to die a humiliating death. He said, then Peter took him aside, and he began to remonstrate with him. And he said, never, you don't have to do this. Don't do this. And then see if this isn't a little harsh. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. That's pretty strong. I mean, this is his best friend. His best friend telling him, you don't have to go down there and suffer this humiliation. Why the strong Satan? Well, actually, he's referring to something else. Remember the beginning of the gospel where Jesus has his temptations with Satan in the desert? And what are the temptations? They're written up differently a little bit in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so on. But ultimately, the temptation is always this. You can pull privilege here. You don't have to. You're the Son of God. You're God's blessed one. You don't have to ever be humbled. You don't have to ever be empty. You don't have to ever be nothing, And remember, Jesus dismisses those as temptations coming from Satan. Ultimately, he's telling Peter, he said, Peter, last time I heard this voice was in the desert, and you don't want to hear who I heard it from, See, you mean real well, but that's Satan's voice you're mimicking, Get behind me, Satan. You're saying there's some other way to Good Friday, to Easter Sunday, other than Good Friday, You don't have to go through this humiliation, and you have to. See, that's the first thing. The cross teaches there's a necessary connection. Jesus says, wasn't it necessary that Christ should so suffer and enter into his glory? Secondly, and this is probably the one we've understood the best. It's important, but this one we tend to get. And that is the paradoxical nature of life and love, joy and delight. You see this, like Jesus has it so many times, where Jesus says, in order to find your life, you have to lose it. If you want something, you got to give it away. But you see that perfectly expressed so wonderfully in the prayer of St. Francis or the works of John at the cross, So Francis would say, if you want to experience consolation, you got to go out and console people. If you want to experience understanding, try to understand somebody. If you want to have happiness, try to make somebody else happy, See, so part of the wisdom of the cross is that it's paradoxical, So simply put, for instance, we can never make ourselves happy. You can never find delight. You can never find joy. They got to find you. And it's always in that other route. If you want delight in your life, try to create delight in somebody else's life. If you want to find meaning for yourself, try to create meaning in other people's lives. See, so it's always the giving it away. And you know, it's a tough lesson for us to learn, you know. Like for instance, we want to have joy and delight in our lives, so we pursue them, you know. That's the times you go out and say, tonight I'm going to have a good time if it kills me. It'll probably kill you, but you can never crank up joy or delight in your life. You can't. And it'll always be false. And in fact, so many of our parties and so on, you know what they are? And I say that sympathetically. Well, you know what we're doing, and I do it too. All the noise and the false joy, it's simply an attempt to keep a depression at bay, you know. Look how happy I am, you know. Remember Shakespeare, methinks the lady protests too much. And every time, you know, we said, look how happy I am. No, we're not happy at all, you know. Joy and delight have to find us. And they come to us. I was giving the people on the weekend retreat a caption, you know. So you know how you make yourself happy? You got to act like God. When you act like God, you get to feel like God. And when we act petty, we get to feel petty. When we act selfish, we get to feel selfish. You know what those feelings are like, you know. See, the cross teaches us that the route to happiness, to joy, delight, to meaning, to everything is by giving it away. You know, the prayer of St. Francis captures it perfectly, you know. See, that's a cross prayer. That's a prayer of the cross. Everything's paradoxical. The person who would lose her life is going to find it. If you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. Thirdly, the centrality of self-sacrifice in love, fidelity, and service. This is kind of, you know, when I grew up, my parents, that was their understanding of the cross, and they got it. Today, I think sometimes we've been so afraid of old piety and theology that we've lost this. Like, for instance, the word sacrifice. There is no other word for it, you know. See, the cross is about sacrifice, so that you have to, and none of that is abstract. It's the person who, you know, this is not abstract. So, for instance, when I was a kid, sometimes you'd have, for instance, in a family, the idea was your family's bigger than you are, and you have to sacrifice for your family. So you'd have this kind of incident, which today we kind of raise our eyebrows at, you know. So some woman didn't get a chance to marry because she had to take care of her mother and dad, you know. And by the time they died, she was too old to marry, you know. So her life was dedicated to taking care of her parents. Then we'd say, well, that's terrible. It's terrible. She missed living life. Well, according to whose standards, you know? See, that's sacrifice. Or a lot of these things, I said, they scare us because they're examples that we don't like, you know. The woman who stays home with kids and she can't have a career, you know, but she lives for her children. Or those of you who are sisters, you know, Catholic sisters who joined an order and you had all these talents and you ended up teaching, you know, grade 2 arithmetic for your whole life because that's what the order needed. They have a joke about the Jesuits. They asked the Jesuit, can you speak French? And he said, not yet. I haven't taught that course yet. Okay. Okay. You know, see, we're simply your family, your church, your country, and a lot of times the old theology of vocation, where it wasn't necessarily that you wanted to be a sister or a priest. You were asked to do that. It's a call. You do it, you know. And but see, just the concept of sacrifice, where there are things higher than our own agenda, and we're called to them, and that's a central part of the cross. Notice Jesus doesn't want to do the cross. He doesn't want to do the cross. He does it because he has to. That's what he's called to. Remember some years ago there was a television program called 30-something, you know, and I'm kind of sorry it went off the air. This was well written. It was the same woman, and she had done another series which even lasted less time called My So-Called Life. And those were pieces which were done really reflectively, and they were well done. But in one episode for 30-something, this is what happened, okay? They have a man, and he's somewhere in his 30s, 30-something, you know, and he goes to some stag party one night, you know, and it's all the men and all his friends and so on. And it's at a hotel, a large hotel in the city, and he's partly in charge of the hospitality to make sure this all goes well. And he's married, happily married with kids and so on. But at the hotel, the woman, the attendant there who's the hotel has assigned to help him with this hospitality is a very young, attractive woman. And they immediately sense some chemistry between the two of them, which happens, okay? So during the evening, they're working together and they're setting up drinks and they're taking away Sprite cans and setting up champagne and so on. And because they sense this attraction, they find lots of excuses to have to be together, as we would do in a similar situation, And the evening wears on and obviously the chemistry is growing, And so finally the party is over and then he helps her clean up and she helps him clean up and they're stalling and they're cleaning up and then, but you can only stall so and so long and finally they got to go home, And so what happens is, well, now is the moment, what's going to happen? So she says to him, I think you sense this too, but there's something between us. It's like if you want, here's my phone number, you could call me and so on. And at the time he's standing guiltily fingering his wedding ring and he says, yeah. He said, but I'll tell you, I should have maybe been more upfront earlier. He said, I'm married. And as much as this has been wonderful, I got to go home to my wife. And he just bolts, And I thought, not a lot of men would do that, But see, at that point he realizes, if I'm going to save my marriage, I got to leave right now. See, that stuff is never abstract. This is a perfect example. You could use that visualize it for a homily on Good Friday, See, that's what the cross means. There's certain times you simply got to sweat blood for your commitment, for your marriage, for your God, for your church, for your country. And what you need at that moment is not what's at issue, My dad was a pretty good theologian, not that he ever studied theology. He got this, and he drilled it into us more than we wanted it drilled into us. And that was his expression. He'd always say, if you don't learn how to sweat blood, you'll never stay in a marriage, you'll never stay in a commitment, you'll never stay anywhere. Because that's what it takes. That's what it's going to take. See, he could have written that 30-something, Certain point, if you're going to be married, this is what it costs. You're going to be a Christian, this is what it costs. You're going to be a nun, this is what it costs, and so on. And the cost is sweating blood. That's not abstract, See, love, service, fidelity, that's the cross. Now the last one, but very importantly, there's an important dimension that has to be added to this, that the cross calls us to make this kind of sacrifice. The cross calls us to altruism. The cross calls us beyond ourself, our own agenda, our own life. But in a certain way, it calls us to do that without resentment. That's the key. And that's no minor key. It calls us to do that without resentment. When you look at what made Jesus' giving of himself so special, wasn't that he died and died violently. Today on this planet, lots of people are going to die violently. It isn't necessarily special at all. People can die violently even voluntarily. The great line from Iris Murdoch, she once said, a common soldier dies without fear, but Jesus died afraid, See, it's not just a question of making a sacrifice. What makes Jesus' sacrifice so special? What makes his giving over so special? And without this, the other part isn't special. And that is, he did it without resentment. It's his famous line, nobody takes my life from me, I give it over freely. See, you know what happens oftentimes for us who are good, honest, sensitive, decent people? Our sensitivity and our decency and our neuroses, all of which are good, they call us into sacrifice. So in fact, we do all the right things, but we don't necessarily do them without being resentful. So again, it's not abstract. Imagine you're the daughter who happens to live here in Belleville, and your mother is in a senior citizens home here, and she's 90 and not in good shape. Your sister's convenient living in Anchorage, Alaska, She can visit your mother once a year for a couple of hours and be doted on, But you got to go every day and every afternoon, and your mother has real needs and so on. And you're the dutiful daughter, and you do it. Now, that's wonderful, but it's only the cross if we're doing it without resentment. If we're going in there and Jesus, my sister's living in Alaska, and I'm the one who's caught and so on. See, then, you know what we're doing? I had a great line once from a nun who was my spiritual director, elderly nun when I was a young priest. And this woman, she was a good one. And she'd always say, when you carry somebody's cross, don't send them the bill, okay? See, the trick is we got to carry each other's crosses, but without a bill. See, when Jesus died, there was no bill. With that wonderful text, come to the water. Come. No money, no price, just come to the water. See, Jesus dies for us, and there's no bill. There's no bill. And when we are resentful, we're sending a bill. And we've all been on both sides of this equation, where we've done hard things for somebody, and we subtly hold them captive. Look what I've done for you, you ungrateful wretch. Or vice versa, somebody's done it to us. Somebody does hard things for us. In fact, a lot of times our suspicions go up immediately. Why is she doing this? There's going to be an angle, and if I bite, I'm going to be caught. I'm going to be indebted, ingratiated, and then we get all these problems and so on. See, that's when we're making sacrifices. We're dying for others, but not without resentment. When Jesus stands before Pilate, and Pilate says to him, I have power to take your life, and I have power to spare you. And Jesus says, you have no power over me whatsoever. Why can he say that? He could tell Pilate, you're a day late. I gave my life to God last night, so you can't take from me by conscription what I've given freely out of love. See, your family, your church, your country, your God, and everything else, they're going to take your life anyway. Jesus says, preempt it. Give it over out of love before they can take it. Let me give you examples of that. For instance, I'm a priest. I work with a lot of priests. And sometimes you get a very sincere priest who's 60 years old and has been living as a celibate his whole life. And he's going to live the rest of his life as a celibate, but he's resentful about it. And he's saying, it's just a stupid rule the church made, and it could be changed, and it's that, Protestants have married clergy, and we could have married clergy, and why don't we have married clergy, and then I got to do this stupid celibacy thing. Well, you may even be right theoretically. It's not the point. It's not the point. But notice what's happening there. It's resentful. Somebody is taking his sexuality from him. If I'm going to be a happy celibate, hard to do. Isn't that kind of an oxymoron? But anyway, you got to be able to say as a nun, nobody takes my celibacy from me. I give it over freely. See, if we don't give it over freely, we're going to be resentful. The same as nobody makes you be the dutiful daughter to your mother. You give it over freely. If you have to do it, you're going to be resentful. Henri Nouwen once coined a great line with this. Nouwen says, the world, at least the sensitive world, it's not divided up between those people who are duty-bound and have sick mothers and have all kinds of duties and pressures in their lives, and those who are free as birds and can do whatever they want. So no, the world is divided up between people who are duty-bound and are resentful about it, and people who are duty-bound and are not resentful about it. We're going to be duty-bound in any case. The world, your family, the church, God is asking for your life. Remember, part of the cross is you got to give your life away. So if all of you in this room this morning, I'm sure you're on the sensitive side of it. So you're giving your life away anyway. Jesus would say that the real key is give it away without being resentful. Say, nobody takes it from me. Nobody takes this from me. I give it over freely. Then we won't be resentful. I want to give you a very, this is trite, but it works. If I had a less trite example, I'd use it, of how you do this. And I'm going to give away one of my trade secrets here too. In the work I do, I have to fly a lot. I'm on airplanes a lot, but as an oblate, since we can't afford batteries, not alone, we fly economy. So after a while, all the good economy seats on a plane, For instance, if you have an aisle seat in the exit row or wherever, it's almost like a business class seat and so on. But so imagine you've booked a flight and you're flying from St. Louis to Rome, 9 hours, and you've taken you got the wisdom and everything else, and you've booked this really good seat for yourself. You get on the airplane, and within 1 minute you realize this is not good, because who's booked in beside you? A man and a woman and about an 18-month-old child, whom they didn't have to buy a seat for, but they'd like your seat, Now, you have two choices. You can put up your briefcase and your luggage on the rack, and you can say, I bought this seat, and just my stupid luck that they are here, and you'll sit down. And you know what will happen? After the seatbelt signs go off at about 40 minutes into the flight, in the transatlantic flight, the airline attendant's going to come and she's going to say, sir, now, or ma'am, would you mind, this is a long flight, and I know they didn't pay for this seat, but there are empty seats on this plane. If you take another seat, they could have this seat for their child, you know. But you also know what seats are left over? All the lousy ones, okay? But then unless you're a complete hick, you're going to have to take your briefcase and move to one of these lousy seats. And you know what? You'll be a sulk all the way to Rome because they took your seat from you and just, my bloody luck, I booked this seat and now this, and so on. And you'll feel petty and angry all the way to Rome. But you could do the Jesus thing, you know. You walk in, you look at this, you don't like it, but you say, you know what, they're going to take the seat anyway. So long before anything happens, say this couple, you like the seat? Yeah. Well, I'll give it to you, you know. And then you take your briefcase and you go and sit in a lousy seat, but you know something? You'll feel like $1 million all the way to Rome, you know. Because you'll be able to say, nobody took my seat from me. But you'll feel like God because you acted like God. See, when we act like God, we get to feel like God. When we act petty, we get to feel petty, you know. And see, resentful. Jesus says, you undercut resentment by giving it over before they take it from you. You say, nobody takes my seat from me. Nobody takes my sexuality from me. Nobody takes my freedom from me. Nobody takes anything from me. I give it over freely, you know. Then you stand before a Pilate and says, you have no power over me. I give it over out of love. See, and that's key to the cross, because when we don't do that, we're going to be resentful, and we'll end up doing the cross. You're going to do it anyway. You're going to be the dutiful daughter who visits your mother every day in the senior citizens home, and you can do it resentfully, or you can say, nobody takes this from me. I give it over freely. And my sister in Alaska is missing a great opportunity, you know, by not being here. You know, see, then we're carrying the cross and we're not sending the bill. That's the key thing. You know, when we have a little resentful, we're carrying the cross and we're sending the bill. Now, just to wrap this thing up here, that's the secret. You know, remember Jesus said, if you get this, you get everything. Then we understand life, love, sacrifice, everything. And when we're standing inside the wisdom of the cross, when we're standing inside the brokenness of Jesus, when we step outside of it, through sin, through whatever, through ideology, then it's all a riddle and nothing makes sense, you know. Now, do we get it or don't we get it? Well, it's not a question of do we get it or not get it. You know, I quote you the Rumi, the mystic, the Sufi mystic. I like what he says. With a secret we sometimes know and then not know. See, we get it and then we don't get it. And some days we're standing inside of it and it makes perfect sense. And it all makes sense. And other times, for whatever reason, we step outside of it. It doesn't make sense. You know, and we move in, we move out. Like Peter, sometimes we step outside. And we're not talking about a door. We're stepping outside the understanding of the cross. And it doesn't make any sense. And then Mark would say, and then none of the gospel makes sense. See, the gospel is not all or nothing. It either all makes sense or it's all a riddle. And the key is the cross. You know, Mark would say, if we get the cross, we get the rest. When we stand inside the cross, it all makes sense. If you step out the way Peter did, and Peter went outside, and it was night out there. See, he stepped into the dark, you know, and then Jesus looked at him, loved him. He gets the cross. He steps back in. The young man whose confession I told you about, you know, he stepped outside, you know. And notice when he was outside, he didn't worry about the gospel at all, okay? Then Jesus looked at him. He stepped back inside. He gets it all, you know. That's the deep secret to the kingdom. The deep secret has nothing to do with the Da Vinci codes. Trust me. You can watch it for entertainment, read it for entertainment. That's Gnosticism. The Gospels are not Gnosticism. That's the code. We're in or we're out. And we're in when we stand inside the cross, when we get the brokenness of Jesus, when we get that necessary connection, when we do it without resentment. As soon as we don't do it, we're stepping outside and nothing makes sense.